Hey. Hello and welcome to the Advances in Research and Innovation stream of the SNOMED CT Expo 2022. My name is Kai Keeley. I'm a technical implementation specialist with SNOMED International, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm repeating this speech again and again for the recording. Most of you have already been in here. All questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation, and online attendees, please use the Q&A box to type your questions. I'm now pleased to introduce Jay Lyle from JP Systems, who will be presenting effects of quantification assumptions on information model semantics. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Am I reaching the microphone from here?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. All right. Next slide, please. Hello, I'm Jay Lyle. I'm a HL7 co-chair, so I'll be bringing an information modeling perspective here. I'm a co-chair for patient care, and we own a resource called Condition, which is a representation of a condition. And there's another resource called a observation, which may represent very similar semantics in some cases. And if you've been around SNOMED for a while, you're familiar with the debate about what's the difference between a finding and a disorder. And this is a very similar question. And you also know the answer is there is none. There's no bright line that you can draw between those two things. So why do we have these two different things, and what's the difference? Next slide, please. So the difference in HL7 FIRE and also in an equivalent model in the RIM is that there are some phenomena that are purely phenomena, that are objective representations of phenomena, and there are some phenomena that are cause for concern. EHRs, for instance, don't care that there's no distinction between a finding and a disorder. They have a table for concerns and problems, and they have another table for facts. So we need to support these use cases in the wild, and so FIRE makes this distinction between concerns that are used to prioritize effort and which imply some sort of constraint or obligation on the provider or the owner of the system, and phenomena which may support or guide or help refine that perception, but which are not in themselves drivers of effort or concern. Next slide, please. A while ago, there was a attempt to model the world in the HL7 reference information model. There are bits of it left in CDA these days. The original is less widely used. And they address this problem by having these problem observations, which might be semantically objective observations of fact, and wrapped in a thing called the concern act, which distinguished the concern from the observation. Because EHRs don't do this, what we find in the actual representations of concerns in CDA documents, next slide, please, or next build, please, is that you get a concern act with a problem observation inside it. The concern act doesn't do anything except flag, this is a concern, not just an observation. In fact, the Structured Documents Committee is looking at a recommendation to adopt this pattern, and because no one is doing the one-to-many pattern, let's simplify the need to be able to digest that complexity and simply have a one-to-one relationship. Next slide, please. In the newer information model in FIRE, there is this similar relationship between conditions and observations. Semantically, you might think that if you had a condition that was a concern about something, that you would need objective observation of that thing first and then an expression of concern. Again, that's not the way systems tend to work. They tend to put conditions in the problem table and observations elsewhere. So if you have COVID, you'll have a condition of COVID and you will not have an observation of COVID, but you may have an observation of supporting evidence like a cough or a test. All right, I think I've covered that. Next slide, please. Within the model, there's a difference in the meta-modeling assumptions here. The condition, as I said, is an expression of concern, and it is defined as a concern. So that's really the only thing you can put in there. Observation, because it needs to be flexible to support different kinds of observations, is very flexible. It's really a meta-model in itself, where you can put in a question and then the answer, and the question can be anything almost. It defines the semantics of the class itself. And so it can be a property, it can be a test result, it can be a question on a questionnaire. et cetera. It can be a variety of things. The case where we get the confusion or discussion or disagreement about which of these two things to use is usually when we're talking about a phenomenon, an assessment of presence of some finding. Typically in the case of either a safety protocol before giving a medication, test and see if I know this problem isn't on your problem list, but before I give you this, I have to ask, that sort of thing, or diagnostic questions of the same category. So, the patient has had unexplained weight loss. Well, let me ask about night sweats. Yes or no? Again, a question of finding presence or absence of related findings. Next slide, please. So, looking at an example, we're finally getting to the title of the presentation. An observation can be characterized as sorry, one moment. This really repeats a lot of what I just said. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. The question of whether or not something goes in a condition is a question of judgment, not of semantics. And an observation here is described in a pattern that I will maybe clearer on the next slide. So we'll go to that one, where is that a build? No.
I don't think the slides changed yet.
I don't think so. Yes, there we go.
Okay.
All right. This is 8. Good. Okay. So the distinction between the condition, where if you have a finding code, the finding code is classifying the condition. I have a concern about something wrong with the patient, and I've classified it as COVID or diabetes or what have you. And the question of whether one use the same kind of finding code or an observation might be considered to be a quantification. And if the answer is yes, the patient does have a cough, we might consider it to be an existential quantifier. There's at least one of these things. And if it is a negative, you might expect it to be, it could be represented as a universal for all the things the patient has. None of them is this one. So we have this distinction between the two assumptions about what the concept code is doing in the information model, whether it's simply classifying something that exists, or whether there's a question that might be accurately represented as a quantifier. There can be ragged boundaries and changes. So for instance, one example would be you're diagnosed with COVID, and one of the facts that supports this diagnosis is the presence of a cough. So you might have a condition of COVID and an observation of cough present. And later you might be admitted to the hospital, and at that point, the cough may become something that is managed, that for the nursing staff is not simply objective information. We're managing the respiratory impairment in the nursing terminology. That would be something that would definitely require concern and intervention and expenditure of resources to address in the role of care provider. And there are other complexities that I won't get into because they're a bit of a rabbit hole. So next slide, please. So to boil it down again, a condition is a business object, and if you put a code on it, you're classifying it. Is this concern for COVID, or is it for diabetes or something else? Whereas in the observation resource, at least, it can be considered to be some sort of quantification effort, whether it's a logical quantifier or not. One reader expressed concern with the idea that an observation is a quantifier, and so I went and changed it in 2 of the 3 places that happened. But so anyway, it can be expressed as such, as I mentioned a moment ago. Observations may provide evidence for conditions, and then they can become conditions. So there are porous boundaries between the two, but we do make a procedural distinction between the things we code or represent in the information model as conditions or observations. Next slide, please. So to articulate this in terms of the concept model, this is a common pattern. I believe this is a well understood and agreed to pattern, where you may have a finding defined as using the attribute of the interprets attribute, looking at a observable or a procedure with an has an interpretation attribute as well with the results. So we have a question and an answer, or a code and a value, or a test and a result. And based on the concept model, those two attributes tell us that this implies a finding. So if you do have, this particular set of attribute values, it is equivalent to a subset of, or a specialization of, or perhaps exactly that finding. Next slide, please. In the fire observation model, we have these two slots. We have one for the code and one for the value. And it seems that if you had such a condition or such a situation, that representing in this way in a fire resource would be appropriate and would meet the expectations and assumptions of most users of both SNOMED and fire. Next slide. And from those two attribute values, you can actually infer that finding. I don't know if this is being done, and there's enough other data in that observation that might call such a thing into question. But semantically, at least, those two properties seem to add up to that finding, and you can represent those with those observation values. Next slide. You may also do the inference yourself. There's another property in the fire observation resource called interpretation, where you may deduce what you might deduce from those codes and make it explicit. So this, I think, is fairly settled, and I have no questions here. I'm just making a background for the next slide. So here we have the question about, does the patient have a cough? We could use the finding object model, and instead of having an interprets property, we'd have something else like an associated with. There may be a need for some other more specific code to use there, but we want to say the question is, what is the presence or absence status of this finding? And then interpretation might be a present or absent qualifier value, or perhaps unknown. There are questions with how broad and deep that value set is. We'd probably need to restrict it if we adopt this pattern. But next slide. Once again, we can put these things into a observation information model. And next slide. Then the question becomes, here's the interesting slide. Once you infer this cough finding, which has a default context of present, it seems like we have this more detailed use at the lower level being equivalent to the upper level only with the interpretation. So this is a bit problematic, and I understand that there are going to be limits on what you can do with this. But next slide, please. So we may want to say there are limits. We don't want to. There are things we may not want to do with this model, but it does provide a way of using the concept model to associate present and absent with a finding. Next slide, please. So to sum up, putting a finding in that observation code is not what a lot of people expect, especially those who are familiar with the lab model. However, we do have a need in the information model to assess presence and absence of questions. One answer might be, of course, to take all of the finding codes and generate observable codes for them. But I think there's some resistance to that. We may want to specialize that associated finding property because it's not very semantically specific. It doesn't say associated with in context of asking questions about presence. There may be something more detailed we would like to do there. It's not surprising. This is very similar to the situation model, but what I'm doing here is purely applying these values to the information model and trying not to step into the ontology domain because of the very problem we just saw on the last slide with where we have the same code in two places in a graph. So I'd like to try to keep that boundary clear since it does seem to be of concern. This approach doesn't solve any intractable computation issues. But it does leave me with two questions, which are going to be what problems do people see with proposing or adopting such a pattern? And if this is a reasonable thing to do, are there things we can do to encourage consensus and understanding in a broader community? But before I ask you to answer those questions, next slide, please. I think that's the end of the proposal, and I'd invite questions.
Thank you, Jay. We will now take questions. Is there any questions from the audience? Yeah.
So I think I have an observation to make about your comments on the observation resource.
I'm concerned.
And a couple. What's that?
I'm concerned.
Yes, exactly. So can we go back to the slide 10? Would that be possible? And well, when we get there, the observation resource, I think, is I mean, really the real kind of main use of it and the intent of it is to have, is to basically, in a sense, ask a question in the code and then have a result in the value, which, sort of its bread and butter use is a quantitative, it's a numeric kind of thing. And we're using it here in a different sense. We're using it as sort of the, I guess I don't know what's the right term, but absolute quantification, presence or absence. That's sort of the, kind of extreme case of it, right? And I think that leads us into some murky waters, and that's why we're having this discussion, right, obviously. But when looking at what you have on here, one thing that struck me, it didn't seem maybe quite the way I would have thought anyway. And that is that you has interpretation and the qualifier about going to observation value, but and then later on we pick up observation interpretation, and I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm wondering if you can say more about that, because it felt to me at first like has interpretation really fits more with observation.interpretation. So I don't know if you want to say more about that.
Yes, that's curious, isn't it? And the way I see it, and I might be wrong, is that has interpretation could have a better name. Yeah. That is the semantics of what's going on in that attribute, and that attribution is really more like result than interpretation.
I think that's maybe true.
Yeah.
But anyway, there's multiple degrees of freedom here, and it's hard to.
We can't change the name of the attribute, right?
Yeah.
So.
Well, my question or my comment, perhaps it's a little bit naive, because I have never really understood version 3 with all this action and what you mentioned. And I always found Fire much more pragmatic, and therefore I wonder if you have the possibility to express the absence or the presence of CAF using condition with verification status and then present or refuted, why do you need to express what I think is really the same thing in observation?
And that is exactly the question I'm trying to make sure gets answered here. So I hope I can answer that.
My answer would be keep it simple.
Right. So you could represent that as a condition, as you've noticed, and many people would like to. The issue is that the condition represents something of concern. So again, there's no bright line semantically between COF as condition and COF as observation, but there is a very clear line procedurally. So if you start representing something like that as condition, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to increase the size of the problem table in the EHR, dramatically. And the second thing you're going to do is you're going to make it necessary for pertinent negatives to introduce negative semantics to the condition table. So those are I think the two main sort of perspectives on why we would like to keep the procedurally concerning things in one place and the evidence and process tracking for safety questions in a different place. But
So I think I kind of agree with, I think, what Stefan was asking or saying, and that leads me to sort of the next question. I mean, if the question we're asking is, does the patient have a cough? And then the answer is yes or no, or or is there I don't know, anyway, presence or absence. Then why, I wonder if that actually fits better with FIRE questionnaire and questionnaire response, rather than trying to fit that into the observations, trying, at least that's another alternative. I mean, if that really is the question that's being asked, and then the only answer can either be present or absent or yes or no, then maybe that actually was what that was for, right?
And I'm gathering the context is not, should this be on the problem list? It's the objective fact question.
Well, in that case, it's just something you're asking. Yeah, we're not even talking about the problem list at that level, before we get to the level of concern.
Right. And so, right, questionnaire is another possible way to do that. It's not searchable.
Why?
Because implementers who need to be able to do searches on whether something is in the record tend to think observations, it's very loose, it's very semantically broad, but it's also a consistent pattern for a very large number of things. So you can ask, if you know a link code or a family of link codes, you can ask this question. Whereas if it's in questionnaire, you have no idea how it was asked.
That's where you actually know exactly how it was asked.
If you have the one question, then you can view the question as it was asked. But if you're searching, does this patient have this? You don't know what the this you're asking about is, because it is not it can be coded, but the perception I get from the implementer community is observations can be much more computable than questionnaire, because questionnaires can be anything. So, thanks.
Hi, Ronald Cornet, Amsterdam UMC. So I understand the need or the possibility of having the same representations for absence and presence, just slightly different forms. But well, as you show, it creates two ways of basically saying the same thing, having the observation or the condition. I was then struck by a line on your proposal slide, which said, this approach does not solve intractable computation problems. So my question would be, what's needed to solve intractable computation problems?
That comment, I've given versions of this sort of talk before, and a lot of it was driven by the need to address representing absence and the negation problem coming up there. And what I'm saying here is I'm not fixing negation. I'm just proposing a way to represent presence and absence for the user in the clinical workflow and some reporting, but not DL.
No, but so maybe not formal DL tractability, but the thing that and I'm struggling with this, so I'm not blaming anyone. I just also try to get my head around and hope to work towards a solution. We try to standardize things to make things easier, but on the other hand, we now create alternative approaches for doing the same thing. With SNOMED embarked on description logics to overcome isosemantic expressions and be able to reason it and determine equivalence. And now these approaches, and like I say, I really understand the the need and the usefulness for it. But they then again create divergence where you have different ways of saying the same thing without the possibility to detect that you have different ways to say the same thing. And you must be very aware, and you should of course always be, when you're searching for information in your record, that you have to explore all different ways in which you could express this. And how are we going to get further with that problem?
So one answer is to use the terminology, because we are looking for one thing. We're looking for the ear and volume finding or the cough finding concept code. There was some pushback about having to look in two places, in condition and observation, rather than just one, which I think is a valid concern. I'm not sure whether it outweighs the procedural concern of having two different sorts of business objects for these things. But if that were the concern, there are also other places that these concepts might show up. Family history, allergy intolerance, adverse event. There are many nooks and crannies, and if you're searching for findings, you need the query to figure out where all those things might be, and not rely on your memory.
Yeah, so but I would say that like family history is a different thing, because family history of cough is not cough. I don't think you will find it in a record, but and especially as I can imagine that the program multiplies if you have other things which you could have in two places, and it relates to, well, cough, which you can have in two ways, and your query, before you know it, if you have three things that you can say in two ways, you have 8 combinations of saying the same thing, and your queries get terribly hard. So and if we can't answer it now, I think it should be on the agenda for SNOMED and HL7 together to really work towards finding ways to overcome it.
If I can add to that, a few years ago, Dr. Campbell at the VA put together a spec for the analysis normal form, which does take conditions and observations and put them into one representation, which I think, again, semantically and maybe for analysis and data warehousing and drill down and all that sort of use case might work perfectly well. What we're facing right now is we have an installed base of systems that keep these things separate. They keep it separate because the process keeps them separate. The clinical process keeps them separate. And we need a way to represent the things that they need in those contexts.
Thank
you.
There's lots of good, healthy discussion here, but we've run out of time, unfortunately. So I'm going to draw this session to a close, and thank you to Jay for the presentation.
Thank you.